Welcome to Empire Economist. I'm grateful you're here. Today, I'm going to tell you a story most history books won't, about a time when America wasn't run by politicians, but by billionaires. Imagine this. A single man walks into a meeting with the President of the United States. Not an elected official, not a general. A private citizen. Yet, when he speaks, the President listens. When the nation's finances collapse, it's not Congress who's called, it's him. This actually happened, and it wasn't just one man. It was a handful of families who quietly ruled America's richest era. They reshaped industries, they influenced elections, they wrote the rules, and then bent them for their own gain. This isn't just a story of wealth, it's a story of invisible empires, unchecked power, and how the playbook they wrote over a century ago still shapes America today. If you're ready to uncover the hidden blueprint of power, hit subscribe, like, and comment below with your thoughts. Let's get into it. Picture this. A single man walks into a meeting with the President of the United States. Not as an elected official, not as a cabinet member, but as a private citizen. Yet when he speaks, the leader of the free world listens. When he offers a solution, the government accepts it without question. When the nation's finances hang in the balance, they turn to him, not Congress, not the Treasury, but him. This wasn't fiction. This was America during its most prosperous era, when a handful of families wielded power so vast that they could reshape entire industries, influence presidential decisions, and control the economic destiny of millions. While history books celebrate the Gilded Age as a time of innovation and growth, they often skip over a darker truth. Behind the gleaming facade of progress stood a shadow government of industrial titans who operated by rules they wrote themselves. Between the 1870s and 1914, these families didn't just accumulate wealth, they accumulated control. And the methods they used to build their empires reveal patterns that echo through American power structures to this very day. This isn't a story about business success. It's a story about how money became a weapon, how competition was eliminated not through better products, but through systematic domination, and how a small group of men redefined what it meant to hold power in America. What makes this era so fascinating and so relevant is that these weren't shadowy conspirators meeting in secret rooms. They operated in plain sight, their methods documented, their influence undeniable. Yet somehow, the full scope of their control has been sanitized from popular memory, reduced to simple tales of entrepreneurial triumph. The reality was far more complex and far more troubling. Take John D. Rockefeller, whose name today adorns universities and philanthropic foundations. By the 1880s, his Standard Oil Company controlled 90% of America's oil refineries and pipelines. But Rockefeller didn't achieve this dominance through superior products or customer service. He achieved it through what investigators would later call the most systematic campaign of industrial warfare ever waged in America. Secret railroad, rebates that undercut competitors, predatory pricing that drove rivals into bankruptcy, espionage networks that tracked every move of opposing companies. When persuasion failed, intimidation followed. When intimidation failed, he simply bought out the competition or destroyed them entirely. The scale of Rockefeller's wealth defies modern comprehension. In today's dollars, his fortune peaked at over $400 billion, making him nearly 3 times wealthier than Jeff Bezos at his peak. But wealth was just the beginning. What Rockefeller and his peers understood was that true power came not from owning money, but from controlling the systems that created money. Standard Oil wasn't just an oil company. It was a financial empire that owned banks, railroads, and politicians. Congressional investigations revealed a web of corruption so extensive that lawmakers struggled to comprehend its scope. Rockefeller's octopus, as political cartoonists depicted it, had tentacles reaching into every corner of American life. The Supreme Court, Congress, state legislatures, regulatory agencies, all influenced by the strategic deployment of what seemed like limitless resources. But Rockefeller wasn't alone in this game of power. Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled 1/5 of the entire American economy through his railroad empire. When he died, his fortune in today's terms would be worth approximately $5 trillion. Andrew Carnegie's steel monopoly supplied the raw materials that built modern America while systematically crushing any competitor who dared challenge his dominance. His workers labored 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in conditions so dangerous that industrial accidents were considered part of the cost of doing business. Perhaps most revealing was how these men viewed their role in society. They didn't see themselves as businessmen operating within a democratic system. They saw themselves as natural leaders, chosen by what they called social Darwinism to guide the economy, and by extension, the nation. This wasn't greed in the traditional sense. This was something more dangerous: the absolute conviction that their success proved their right to rule. J.P. Morgan embodied this philosophy perhaps more than anyone. His banking house didn't just lend money, it determined which industries would thrive and which would fail. When the federal government faced financial crisis, they didn't turn to Congress or the Treasury. They turned to Morgan. He single-handedly prevented the panic of 1907 from destroying the American economy, but only on his terms, consolidating even more power in the process. The methods these families used to maintain their dominance created a blueprint that would influence American power structures for generations to come. They understood that controlling information was as important as controlling capital. They owned newspapers, funded universities, and shaped public opinion through what we would now recognize as sophisticated propaganda campaigns. What's most striking about this era isn't just the concentration of wealth, but how systematically these families worked to eliminate any meaningful opposition to their rule. They didn't just compete in markets. They captured the mechanisms that governed those markets. They didn't just influence politicians. They created the conditions that made politicians dependent on their support. The story of how these families built and maintained their secret rule over America reveals timeless lessons about power, control, and the fragility of democratic institutions when faced with concentrated wealth. Their influence extended far beyond boardrooms and bank vaults. These families understood that true control required shaping the very fabric of American society. They funded universities, endowed libraries, and established foundations that would carry their vision forward long after they were gone. The Carnegie libraries that dot American towns weren't just acts of charity. They were investments in cultural influence, ensuring that future generations would view these men as benevolent leaders rather than ruthless monopolists. The Astor family exemplified this strategy of social control. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor, created what became known as the 400, an exclusive list of New York society's elite. This wasn't merely social snobbery. It was a deliberate mechanism to determine who could access the networks of power that truly ran America. If you weren't on Mrs. Astor's list, you couldn't attend the gatherings where business deals were struck, political alliances were formed, and the future direction of industries was decided. The genius of this system was its appearance of legitimacy. Unlike European aristocrats who inherited their titles, these American families claimed their power through merit, through their supposed superiority in the marketplace. They wrapped their dominance in the language of democracy and free enterprise, even as they systematically dismantled both. Consider how they handled labor disputes. When Carnegie's workers at the Homestead Steelworks went on strike in 1892, demanding basic safety protections and living wages, Carnegie didn't negotiate. He locked them out and hired private armies, literally armed mercenaries, to break the strike. The resulting battle left 10 men dead and demonstrated to workers across America that challenging these families meant risking not just your livelihood, but your life. Yet Carnegie simultaneously positioned himself as a champion of the working class, writing essays about the moral obligations of wealth and funding libraries for the very communities whose workers he was crushing. This wasn't hypocrisy in the traditional sense. It was something more calculated, the systematic creation of a public image that obscured the brutal methods used to maintain power. The railroad barons perfected similar techniques. They didn't just own the trains, they owned the towns the trains passed through. Company housing, company stores, company schools, all designed to create populations entirely dependent on their goodwill. Workers paid rent to the company, bought food from company stores at inflated prices, and sent their children to schools that taught company-approved curricula. It was a form of economic feudalism dressed up as industrial progress. What made this system particularly insidious was how it corrupted the very institutions designed to protect the public. Regulatory agencies were captured by the industries they were supposed to oversee. Judges received strategic donations to their campaigns. Newspapers depended on advertising revenue from the same companies they were supposed to investigate. The result was a democracy that functioned in name only, while real decisions were made by a small group of families operating according to their own interests. The lessons from America's Gilded Age remain as relevant today as they were over a century ago. These families didn't just build fortunes, they constructed a framework for concentrating power that transcended their own lifetimes. Their methods of controlling markets, capturing institutions, and shaping public opinion created blueprints that continue to influence how power operates in modern America. Understanding this history isn't about nostalgia or condemnation. It's about recognizing patterns that help us make sense of our current economic and political landscape. The same techniques used to consolidate control during the Gilded Age appear in different forms today, adapted to new technologies and new markets, but fundamentally unchanged in their objectives. What's most important to remember is that none of this happened in secret. The evidence was documented, investigated, and reported. Congressional hearings exposed the methods, newspapers chronicled the abuses, political cartoonists mocked the excesses. Yet somehow, the full scope of this systematic control has been reduced to sanitized stories of entrepreneurial success. The real lesson isn't that these families were uniquely evil, or that their era was uniquely corrupt. The lesson is that concentrated wealth always seeks to perpetuate and expand itself through the capture of institutions designed to constrain it. This is not a moral failing. It is simply what concentrated power does when left unchecked. History shows us that understanding these patterns is the first step toward recognizing them in our own time. When we know how power operated in the past, we become better equipped to identify how